So I want you to picture this really lush, just incredibly dense forest.
Yeah, I'm picturing it.
And sitting together on this massive fallen log are four heavily armored kings.
Right.
They just look exhausted, like their shoulders are weighed down by some invisible generational burden. And then towering in the background, sort of peeking through the canopy of the trees, is this magnificent multi-tiered white city that's literally carved directly into the side of a mountain.
It is a really profound, almost haunting image, honestly.
Yeah, it really is.
What's absolutely crucial to understand right off the bat is that those four men never actually sat on a log together.
Yeah.
Like, that never happened.
Wait, really? It's just made up.
Yeah, totally symbolic. That mosaic was commissioned centuries later just to represent a lineage, right? A bloodline that basically dragged a whole civilization through fire, water, and ruin.
Wow. Which I guess brings us to exactly what we are unpacking today. If you're joining us on this deep dive, you know that history rarely moves in straight lines.
Oh, for sure. Never.
Right. So we are looking at this massive 230-year saga stretching from the year 250 to 480.
It's a huge chunk of time.
It is. And our mission today is to track how a pretty peaceful inland farming society morphed into this naval powerhouse and then lost absolute everything to a rival pirate kingdom.
Yeah, literally everything.
And somehow, through sheer, I don't know, organizational willpower, rebirthed itself into an unstoppable continent-spanning empire.
It's wild. And, we have the incredible privilege of doing this by weaving together two vastly different historical sources today.
Yes, the sources are so good for this one.
They really are. Our primary lens today, which I am just so thrilled to dive into, is this deeply subjective, highly dramatized royal chronicle compiled in the year 480 by a man named Aurelius Marcion.
Right, the kings and emperors of Gondor.
Exactly. And Marcion wasn't just, recording dates. He was writing a tragedy, a triumph, and basically a political manifesto all at the exact same time.
I mean, he gives us the sweat, the palace intrigue, the desperate midnight conversations, all of it.
He really does. But, to make sure we don't just fall for the royal propaganda.
You're right. We need a reality check.
Yeah, you've brought along a counterweight. I'm constantly cross-referencing Marcion's theatrical accounts with this brilliantly dry, completely objective overview called LeganWar.pdf.
Compiled by the Order of Neutral Scholars.
Yes, where Marcion gives us, like, the king's tiers, the neutral scholars, give us the grain quotas and the troop mortality rates.
That's spreadsheets, basically.
Exactly, ancient spreadsheets. And the friction between these two texts is really where the truth lives.
So, to begin, we sort of need to set the board. Like, if I'm a listener trying to visualize this world around the year 250, who are the Gondorians?
Right, good starting point.
What is a baseline before all this chaos erupts?
Well, at this point, the Gondorians are a deeply agrarian, very pragmatic people. They inhabit these incredibly fertile inland valleys east of the Legan Sea.
Okay.
If you read the neutral scholars' geographical surveys, Gondor's wealth is entirely terrestrial. We're talking wheat, barley, extensive orchards.
They're farmers.
Mostly, yeah. They are absolutely not conquerors. They don't have standing professional armies in any modern sense. They just have, like, local militias to keep the peace.
They sound comfortable, like really insulated.
Highly insulated, and that's reflected in their culture and religion, too. They worship a pantheon known as Divintus.
Which has, what, 4 main gods?
Right, 4 primary gods. There's Belem, the god of war, Willem, the god of harvests, Ekrur, the god of the sea, and Paris, the god of the poor.
Got it.
But in 250, their society is almost entirely structured around Willem. Their whole calendar is dictated by the sowing and the reaping.
So they're basically burning grain on the altars, thanking the harvest god. They probably aren't paying much attention to Belem or Ekwur.
Exactly. The sea is just like a boundary to them.
Yeah.
And war is this abstract concept that happens to other people far away.
But the world doesn't let you ignore it forever.
No, it never does. Because across the Legan Sea, a completely different sociological experiment is taking place.
Right, the rise of the Scions, or as the Gondorian texts refer to them, the Scions.
Yes. And their origin is just a masterclass in how desperation breeds innovation.
From what I understand, they weren't just some rival farming kingdom that slowly grew over time, right?
No, not at all. The Scions were born out of absolute trauma. They were originally refugees.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, up in the north, there was this massive Zarchian civil war. The losing faction specifically, the upper-class elites who adhered to Orthodox Sardian Catholicism, they fled their homeland.
They just packed up and left.
They had to.
Yeah.
They sailed south and washed up on the shores of a place called Palm Bay, which they very quickly renamed Cyanide Bay.
So you have this highly educated, deeply religious, newly displaced elite class suddenly forced to survive on this tiny coastal strip of land.
Right, and survival forced them to adapt brutally. I mean, they didn't have the vast fertile valleys of the Gondorians. They had timber and the ocean.
So they turned to the sea.
Exactly, and initially they turned to piracy. But what makes them terrifying is that they brought advanced Zartian shipbuilding techniques with them, and they fused their naval operations with intense religious fervor.
Wow, that is a volatile mix. You've got displaced nobility who believe they have a divine mandate, utilizing cutting-edge nautical engineering to survive by raiding.
Yeah, Marston's chronicle describes their early capital as almost alien. He writes about a palace designed to mimic a massive, sprawling tree sitting directly adjacent to a towering, imposing cathedral.
So church and monarchy weren't just aligned, they were structurally intertwined.
Exactly, and by the time we hit the late 3rd century, these highly organized pirates begin looking across the Aegean Sea.
Looking at Gondor.
Right. They see the wealthy, slow-moving merchant caravans of Gondor bringing grain to the coast, and they see an opportunity.
Which leads us to the catalyst. Because every great shift in history usually requires someone who realizes the old rules no longer apply.
Absolutely.
And for Gondor, that realization comes in the year 300 with a man who seems entirely unsuited for the moment, King Laureus Amadus.
Yes, Laureus. He inherits this booming, peaceful economy. But the inciting incident of his reign is the escalation of the Scion threat.
Right.
The pirates of Palm Bay start systematically picking off Gondorian merchant ships. The neutral scholars track the economic data, and it goes from like a fractional loss of cargo in 295 to a crippling disruption of coastal trade by 302.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Laureus's response is so counterintuitive to how ancient kings usually behave.
Evil completely.
When you read Marston's account of Laureus's youth, he doesn't sound like a conqueror. Honestly, he sounds like a modern tech CEO forcing a massive pivot, or like an accountant.
Yeah, he was famously averse to traditional martial pursuits. I mean, the aristocracy of Gondor expected their princes to hunt boar, master the sword, lead cavalry charges.
The usual royal stuff.
Right, but Laureus despised all of it. Marston actually includes a fascinating quote from the young prince's tutor, who wrote to the king with this mix of awe and frustration.
What did he say?
He wrote, "The boy asks not who rules beyond the mountains, but how their grain reaches the coast."
Wow. He was obsessed with logistics.
He really was. He saw the kingdom not as a map of territories, but as a nervous system of supply chains.
So when the pirate raids escalate, his generals, these seasoned traditional noblemen, they give him the standard playbook, right?
Yeah, the primary voice of tradition was General Marcus Bellion. The neutral scholars record Bellion's formal proposal. He wanted to pull back from the coast entirely.
Just abandon it.
Basically. He argued they should build fortified inland roads, construct massive stone silos, and essentially turtle up.
And the treasurer agreed, right?
Yeah, the royal treasurer suggested they simply let the merchant guilds hire private mercenaries to guard their caravans.
So if we think about this like a biological organism, the generals are saying, the environment is getting dangerous, let's grow a thicker shell.
That's a great way to put it.
But Laureus looks at the exact same problem and says, no, we need to grow gills and teeth. He rejects the defensive posture entirely.
What's fascinating here is how Laureus diagnoses the root cause of the problem. He realizes that you cannot permanently defend a coastline against an enemy that controls the water.
Right, because they can just hit you wherever you aren't.
Exactly. If the enemy has the mobility of the sea, they will always dictate where and when the violence happens. Marston quotes Laureus standing in the Senate, pointing to a map of the Aegean Sea, and delivering 6 words that shift the trajectory of their civilization.
Let me guess. They come from the sea. So shall we.
You got it.
It's a brilliant pivot. But, you know, it's one thing to say you're going to build a navy. It's another to actually conjure a maritime industrial complex out of a farming economy.
It's an astronomical task.
How does he actually execute this?
Through sheer logistical obsession. He doesn't just hire a few boat builders. He identifies a naturally defensible rocky inlet on the coast.
Okay.
And then he redirects massive amounts of state funds, which absolutely infuriated the Senate, by the way, to import shipwrights, harvest specific types of timber, and quarry stone for dry docks.
He just forces it through.
Yeah, for 3 solid years, he turns this quiet inlet into the largest construction zone the continent has ever seen.
And what he produces is the Eversor-class warship, which, if you're picturing a slightly bulkier merchant vessel, you need to erase that from your mind.
Oh,
Yeah.
completely. The Eversur was a floating fortress.
Yeah.
The neutral scholars provide the schematics, and they're wild. These ships featured heavily reinforced, triple-layered wooden hulls.
Triple layered.
Yes, explicitly designed to withstand high-speed ramming. But more importantly, Lorius incorporated elevated, fortified fighting decks.
Right, I read about this. This allowed Gondorian archers to stand way above the pirate vessels and fire downward like
Exactly. It
hunters.
completely nullified the pirates' advantage in close quarters boarding combat. If you try to board, you're just getting rained on by arrows from above.
It's a total paradigm shift, and he doesn't just build the ships and wait for the pirates to come to him. In 309, he goes on the offensive.
And this is where the logistics translate into absolute devastation. The Gondorian fleet sails across the Leagan Sea.
I can't even imagine what the pirates thought.
Right. The pirates, who are accustomed to chasing slow grain barges, suddenly find themselves facing organized squadrons of these massive armored Eversurs.
It must have been a slaughter.
The resulting campaign isn't just a victory, it is a systematic dismantling of the pirate flotillas.
Marson records that when Lorius returns, he addresses the Senate, who had been complaining about the budget for 3 whole years.
Oh, the vindication must have been sweet.
It really was. He delivers this incredible line. The sea belongs not to those who steal from it, but to those who secure it.
What a quote.
It really is. It's an incredible moment of vindication.
It is, but we do have to look past the rhetoric a bit. Because Lorius's true genius wasn't just winning the Battle of 309, it was what he built immediately after.
Right, the institutions.
Exactly. He understood that a fleet of ships will eventually rot. Wood decays. To maintain dominance, you need a self-sustaining system. So he founds Gondor's first permanent naval academies.
He codifies maritime law.
Yes, he creates a pipeline of professional officers. He builds a machine designed to outlast him.
But, and there is always a but, when a leader is this successful, he had a blind spot, a pretty massive one.
He did. His pragmatism occasionally mutated into arrogance. Lorius believed that by crushing the pirate fleets, he had permanently solved the Scion equation.
He thought it was over.
Right. He forced the pirates to stop raiding. But he didn't realize that by cutting off their easy revenue, he forced them to evolve.
Which makes sense. If you stop the refugees from being pirates, they have to become a state. And we see this happen almost immediately.
We really do.
In 310, the most powerful of the pirate leaders, a guy named Supil Stulsti, realizes the raiding era is over. So he consolidates power, formalizes their government, and crowns himself King Lumber I of Scion.
How does Lorius react to this? With dismissive contempt.
Yeah, Marcin notes that when Lorius was informed of the coronation, he literally laughed and said, "Pirates wearing crowns remain pirates."
He just couldn't see the transformation. He was looking at King Lumber I and seeing a street gang leader, completely missing the fact that this gang was rapidly absorbing Zartian Catholic engineering, military discipline, and centralized governance.
They were building a state specifically designed to avenge the defeat of 309.
Exactly. And by the time Lorius is nearing the end of his life, around 340, the reality of his miscalculation has finally set in.
Too little, too late.
Yeah. Intelligence reports from the neutral scholars show the Scions expanding their shipyards, drilling disciplined marines, and experimenting with new hull designs. The machine Lorius built was facing a rival machine that was hungrier and way more adaptable.
Marcin gives us this really haunting scene on Lorius's deathbed. He's surrounded by his council, the men who now run the academies and the fleets he built.
And his dying words are a warning. Right?
Yeah. He says, "Do not fear the sea. Fear the day another commands it."
It's a terrifyingly accurate prophecy, because Lorius built a complex, demanding system, and a system that requires constant vigilance is uniquely vulnerable to a successor who fundamentally misunderstands the world.
Which brings us to Act 2 of this saga, the era from 340 to 375, the reign of King Flavius Lorius.
The dark age of good intentions.
Yes. And I have to admit, as I was reading through the sources, Flavius tore me right down the middle.
Oh, me too.
Because it's so easy to paint him as the villain who lost the empire. But his psychological profile is deeply tragic.
Flavius is a profound case study in the danger of good intentions. If you read only the neutral scholars, Flavius is a disaster, a statistical anomaly of failure.
The economy shrinks, the borders collapse, the military rots.
Exactly. But Marcin's chronicle reveals a man who is deeply intellectual, highly empathetic, a poet, and a philosopher. He genuinely believed in the inherent goodness of people.
And if you're a listener right now thinking, well, what's wrong with having a moral, empathetic leader? You have to remember that context is everything.
It really is.
Flavius was born in the absolute peak of his father's golden age. He never saw the burning villages of 295. He never saw the desperate construction of the dry docks.
Right. He was raised in a world where Gondor was untouchable.
His worldview was completely shaped by his primary tutor and advisor, Senator Lucerian Cassus.
And Cassus was an old garden noble who deeply resented the military apparatus Lorius had built. Cassus taught young Flavius that true nobility wasn't found in a sword or a ship, but in diplomacy, consensus, and civil debate.
So Flavius takes the throne in 340, fully believing that every conflict is just a misunderstanding waiting for a committee to resolve it.
Which is a terrible mindset when you're dealing with a rising superpower.
Exactly. And meanwhile, across the Legan Sea, the Scion Kingdom has fully matured. The Zartian migrants have integrated their engineering marvels into the Scion shipyards, and they launch a technological terror. The Crusader ships.
The Crusaders changed the calculus of naval warfare on the Legan Sea overnight.
Let's talk about the design because it's so smart.
Yeah. The neutral scholars provide stark contrasts here. Gondor's Eversor ships, built by Lorius, were heavy, durable, designed for slow ramming and high-deck archery, like we discussed.
Right.
The Scion Crusaders, on the other hand, stripped away the heavy upper decks to significantly increase speed and maneuverability. And they painted the sails a distinct, intimidating blue.
But the real nightmare wasn't just the speed of the ships, it was what they carried inside.
Yes, the Bethler Knights.
Named after a revered Zartian Catholic saint, right?
Exactly. And these were not just sailors who knew how to fight. They were elite, heavily armored marine infantry. The Crusaders were specifically designed to quickly close the distance, evade the Eversor's slow ramming arcs, grapple the Gondorian ships, and unleash these heavily disciplined knights directly onto the decks.
It perfectly countered the Gondorian strategy. It's like rock, paper, scissors, and they brought paper to cover the rock.
Absolutely. And how does the Admiralty in Gondor react when reports of these blue-sailed ships start arriving?
I'm guessing not well.
With catastrophic hubris. Marson records the admirals telling Flavius, "Our Eversors are walls of oak. Let the pirates break their teeth on them." They completely refuse to adapt.
And so begins what the historians call the slow collapse. It isn't one massive apocalyptic battle that breaks Gondor, right?
No, it's a systemic asphyxiation.
The neutral scholars track the economic decay with brutal precision. In 342, a merchant convoy disappears. In 345, the insurance rates for coastal shipping quadruple.
That's a huge indicator.
Yeah, by 348, entire coastal fishing villages are abandoning their homes and moving inland. The Scions are using their speed to bypass the lumbering Gondorian naval patrols, striking the civilian infrastructure directly.
And what is Flavius doing while his citizens are fleeing the coast?
He's convening councils.
Yes, councils and committees. This is where his adherence to consensus becomes lethal. When the Admiralty finally realizes their ships are obsolete and begs for emergency funding to redesign the fleet, Flavius brings it to the Senate.
And the Senate, led by Cassus, argues about the tax burden.
Right. They form a committee to study the ship designs. They delay the vote for the Harvest Festival. Flavius listens to everyone, refuses to act unilaterally, and as a result, absolutely nothing
I
happens.
want to pause here, though, and challenge the historical consensus a bit.
Okay, let's do it.
Is it possible that Flavius was paralyzed not just by weakness, but because he was fighting a multi-front war, culturally speaking? Because it wasn't just the ships failing. Gondor was undergoing a massive, volatile demographic shift internally.
That is a vital piece of the puzzle, actually. The trade routes that Lorius secured decades earlier didn't just bring wealth, they brought ideas.
Right.
Gondorian merchants who had lived and traded in Scion ports began returning home, and they brought Christianity with them.
And we need to look at this purely through the lens of sociological mechanics.
Right. And just to be completely clear for everyone listening, we're just looking at the historical records here as documented by the neutral scholars.
Right, exactly. We aren't endorsing any theological stance, just reporting on the very real demographic clashes that happened.
Precisely. We have a deeply entrenched traditional society that has worshipped the Divintus pantheon for centuries. And suddenly, a new monotheistic belief system begins taking root among the merchant class in the cities.
The friction is immediate and severe.
It really is. The Da Vincian priests and conservative senators view this new demographic not just as a religious difference, but as a cultural infiltration by the very enemy that is currently sinking their ships.
Which is a terrifying connection to make if you're a local citizen.
Yeah, the neutral scholars document a tragic rise in domestic violence. Christian-owned warehouses are torched, neighborhoods are segregated, citizens are disappearing in the night.
It's tearing the social fabric apart. And this is where Flavius's empathy completely short-circuits his ability to govern. Marcen describes Flavius receiving tearful petitions from persecuted Christian families begging for royal protection.
And simultaneously, he is receiving demands from the Da Vincian high priest to expel the foreign influence to appease the gods of war and harvest.
So he's trapped.
Completely. A ruthless king would have picked a side and purged the other to enforce stability. A pragmatic king would have strictly enforced secular law to maintain the economy.
But Flavius doesn't either.
No. He forms another committee. He tries to draft treatises on theological harmony while his cities are literally burning.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he governs the world he wishes existed rather than the bloody, complex reality in front of him.
That's spot on.
There is one highly dramatized conversation in Marcin's text that just perfectly distills the tragedy of Flavius. It's late at night, the kingdom is fracturing, and Flavius visits the high priest of Bellum, the war god.
Oh, this scene is incredible.
It is. Flavius, exhausted, asks the priest, "Why is peace so difficult to keep?"
And the priest's response is one of the most chilling lines in the entire chronicle. He looks at the king and says, "Because peace belongs to farmers. Kings borrow it from soldiers."
Oh man, it's just a devastating rebuke of Flavius's entire philosophy.
It really is.
And the bill for his inaction comes due in the year 331. This is the absolute nadir, the sack of Gondor.
And the irony of the sack of Gondor is that it wasn't even the Scion military that executed it.
Wait, really? It wasn't the Scions?
No. The Gondorian army had been stretched so incredibly thin, deployed in small packets along the coast, trying to protect isolated merchant routes, that the capital itself was virtually undefended.
Wow.
Recognizing this vacuum, an opportunistic coalition of northern mountain bandits, several thousand desperate armed men simply walked out of the hills and descended on the White City.
Just imagine the psychological shock of that. For generations, this multi-tiered city carved into the mountain was considered inviolable. And suddenly, common bandits are burning the outer districts.
They're looting the warehouses, destroying the lower harbor. Marcen writes that the smoke from the burning grain hung over the palace for 3 days.
It shattered the illusion of Gondorian supremacy, and it signaled to the Scions that Gondor was effectively bleeding out.
Which directly precipitates the First League War, running from 349 to 353, where the Scions formally annexed the Lowmounts, permanently establishing a foothold on Gondorian soil.
But the geopolitical collapse is almost overshadowed by the personal tragedy that breaks Flavius.
Yeah, this part is just heartbreaking.
Around the year 360, Flavius and Queen Livia's only son, Prince Maximus, who is just 6 years old, falls ill and dies suddenly.
It is the final blow to a man who was already crumbling. The neutral scholars note that after 360, Flavius ceases to attend Senate meetings entirely.
He just gives up.
He does. But Marcen gives us access to Flavius's private letters to his wife, and they are agonizing to read because he is entirely self-aware. He writes, "I inherited walls already built. My father left me victories already won. I fear I have mistaken inheritance for achievement."
He knows he failed.
Yeah.
When he finally passes away in 375, there is no grand assassination, no dramatic final stand. He simply fades. Marcen records his final conversation with Queen Livia. He is sitting on a western terrace, looking out at the Legan Sea, a sea that is now entirely controlled by blue Scion sails. He says, "My father feared the day another would command the sea." Livia tries to offer some small comfort, saying, "It was never yours alone to lose," and Flavius replies, "No, but it was mine to save."
It is a pathetic, quiet end to a disastrous era. But the universe has a strange way of balancing itself out,
That's so.
Because while Flavius's reign was a systemic failure, the psychological trauma inflicted on the generation that survived the Dark Age created a profound counter-reaction.
And that counter-reaction takes the form of his surviving heir, which moves us into Act 3, the era of King Maximus Flavius, who rules from 375 to 420, known to history as the Reformer.
Maximus is the quintessential product of his environment. If Flavius was shaped by the golden age of peace, Maximus was forged in the humiliation of the Dark Age.
He didn't grow up watching merchant ships bring wealth.
No, he grew up watching the smoke rise from the lower city. Marcen recounts a deeply telling anecdote from Maximus's childhood. The young prince, maybe 8 years old, is walking through the capital and sees a group of Gondorian merchants. He asks his tutor why the men selling grain are wearing armor and carrying swords.
And the tutor, likely trying to shield the boy from the full geopolitical reality, simply says, because the sea no longer belongs to us.
Right. And the 8-year-old Maximus doesn't cry. He doesn't ask for a committee. He looks at his tutor and says, then we must take it back.
That is the thesis of his entire life right there. When he comes of age, he completely rejects the traditional aristocratic path. He refuses to study poetry or philosophy. He demands to be apprenticed to the military apparatus.
But what is so fascinating is how he approaches this apprenticeship. He doesn't just want to learn how to swing a sword. He channels his grandfather Laureus's obsession with systems.
Okay, let's dig into that.
The neutral scholars detail how Maximus spent months rotating through the shipyards, the quartermaster corps, the treasury, and the frontline barracks. One exasperated general actually complained to the Senate that the crown prince spends more time counting the grain in the wagons than counting the soldiers in the field.
But that's exactly what wins wars. I mean, Maximus realizes that individual bravery means absolutely nothing if the supply lines collapse.
Exactly.
He marches with the underfunded border patrols. He sails on the outdated, rotting Eversur ships. And through this grueling immersion, he diagnoses the fatal flaw of the Gondorian military. He writes it down in a manifesto that survives in Marcin's text.
I love this quote.
Yeah, it says, "We lose not because our men lack courage. We lose because courage has no organization."
Let's really unpack the mechanics of that statement because it is revolutionary. In the old system, the Gondorian military was essentially a collection of aristocratic fiefdoms. Nobles bought their commissions, generals raised their own local militias, supplied them through their own wealth, and fought largely independently.
Which is fine if you're fighting disorganized bandits. But when you are facing a centralized, ideologically unified machine like the Scion Kingdom, a decentralized aristocratic militia just gets slaughtered.
Precisely. Maximus realized the entire foundation of the kingdom needed to be ripped up and rebuilt from scratch. So upon taking the throne in 375, he initiates a massive centralization of power.
He strips the nobility of their independent military commands, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He establishes two supreme governing bodies, the Army Council and the Admiral Council.
He takes war out of the hands of wealthy amateurs and puts it into the hands of a bureaucratic machine. He standardizes the size of a legion, the length of a spear, the daily caloric intake of a sailor. It is ruthless standardization.
Standardizing the military requires competent people to run it. You can't just rely on whoever happens to be born into a noble family anymore.
Right.
This leads to Maximus's most radical reform, the creation of two permanent state-funded military academies, one for the Army, one for the Navy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where Maximus truly changes the DNA of Gondor. To enter these academies, you didn't need a noble title. You needed to pass an entrance examination.
It was the birth of a true meritocracy. The neutral scholars show the shifting demographics of the officer corps. Within a decade, you have the sons of bakers and blacksmiths studying logistics, topography, and naval tactics alongside the sons of senators.
That's wild.
If you had the intellect and the drive, the state would train you to lead.
It's an incredible sociological shift, but within this new meritocratic system, Maximus builds an elite tier that is, frankly, my favorite part of this entire depth dive, the Imperial Skirmisher Corps.
Well, the skirmishes are fascinating. They weren't just shock troops. They were designed to be the central nervous system of the new military.
How so?
Well, the recruiters for the Skirmisher Corps specifically sought out orphans, the disenfranchised, the sharpest minds from the lowest rungs of society, individuals who owe their entire existence, their loyalty, solely to the king and the state, not to any noble family.
And the curriculum they went through was mind-bending for the 4th century. We're not just talking about advanced swordplay here. Marcin's texts detail how skirmisher cadets were trained in structural engineering so they could build or destroy bridges.
They were taught the Zartian language so they could interrogate Scion prisoners.
They studied metallurgy, reconnaissance, cryptography, and early explosives. It's like an ancient special forces program.
They were the ultimate adaptable officers. If a general was killed in battle, a skirmisher captain could instantly assume command, redraw the supply lines, negotiate with local tribes, and organize a retreat. Maximus designed them to ensure the machine never stopped functioning, even under catastrophic stress.
And this academy system produces a legendary generation of leaders. Marcin's chronicle focuses heavily on 3 specific skirmisher graduates who will shape the future of the world: Matthias Comminus, Siberius Octavius, and Siphius Fabius.
Such a fascinating trio. Matthias Comminus was the architect. Calm, brutally pragmatic, a logistical savant who could see the entire theater of war in his mind.
Wow.
Then you had Siberius Octavius, who was the Blade. Ambitious, charismatic, fearless, a man who commanded such intense loyalty that soldiers would gladly walk into fire for him.
And the third?
Cepheus Fabius was the Ghost, a quiet, patient man who mastered archery and stealth, operating on the fringes of the battlefield.
So Maximus spends decades building this machine, tuning it, staffing it with this new breed of hyper-competent officers. And by the year 410, the economy has recovered, the shipyards are producing modernized, faster vessels, the machine is humming.
And Maximus decides it is time to turn the key.
In 415, after a century of being on the defensive, Gondor strikes first. Maximus launches the Second Legion War.
And the opening maneuvers completely blindside the Scions. I mean, they had grown accustomed to fighting this slow, hesitant Gondor of Flavius's era. Suddenly, they are facing a synchronized, rapidly moving force.
Thanks to Matthias, right?
Exactly. Matthias Commodus organizes supply chains that allow Gondorian infantry to march twice as fast. Siberius Octavius leads lightning strikes that reclaim the eastern Troadian forests and push down to secure the southern river valleys.
The neutral scholars refer to it as the most efficient military campaign of the era. The Gondorians systematically dismantle the Scian outposts, pushing all the way to the western edge of the continent until they reach the ultimate strategic prize, the city of Dorwinia.
Dorwinia is the gateway to the Western Sea. If Gondor takes it, they break the Scian monopoly on maritime trade completely.
So Siberius and Matthias lay siege to the city. They surround it, build circumvallation walls, and begin strangling it.
A siege lasts for grueling months. But the Scions understand the existential threat. King Lumber III of Sion personally leads a massive, desperate relief army across the sea, landing on the beaches near Dorwinia.
This triggers the Battle of Dorwinia in 419. Marcin dedicates entire chapters to this single battle, and it is an absolute bloodbath. It's the unstoppable force of the Scian Crusaders and Bethlar Knights slamming into the immovable object of Maximus's modernized, disciplined legions.
The fighting rages for days in the mud and the surf. Ultimately, the siege breaks. The Gondorian army, facing catastrophic casualties, is forced to execute an organized withdrawal. Tactically, they fail to take Dorwinia. The Scions retain the city.
But strategically,
Strategically, it was a massive triumph for Gondor. They did not rout, they retreated in good order, and they successfully held all the vast territories they had reclaimed in the east and the south.
so they proved they could hold their ground.
They had proven to the world, and more importantly to themselves, that they could go toe-to-toe with the apex predators of the continent and survive. The psychological shadow of the Dark Age was lifted.
But the price of that victory was the architect himself. King Maximus is mortally wounded during the Battle of Dorwinia. Marcin describes a chaotic cavalry skirmish, where a Zartian lance shatters against Maximus's side, driving splintered armor into his ribs. He is carried back to the capital on a litter.
He spends his final months governing from a bed covered in maps, his breath growing shallower every week. And as he lays dying, Gondor faces a terrifying constitutional crisis.
Because Maximus has no surviving sons.
Right. According to the strict ancient laws of Gondor, his daughters cannot inherit the throne. The Senate and the remaining nobility are in an absolute panic. They propose various distant cousins, uncles, anyone with a drop of royal blood. They beg Maximus to officially name an heir, to sign a decree to ensure a smooth transition.
But Maximus refuses. He looks at the noble candidates and sees the very aristocratic incompetence he spent his entire life trying to eradicate. He knows that if he hands his finely tuned, lethal military machine back to a wealthy amateur, it will destroy the kingdom.
So he leaves the throne empty. It is a stunning, terrifying choice.
It really is.
Marcin records one final, intimate conversation between the dying King Maximus and his most charismatic commander, Siberius Octavius. Maximus is coughing blood, staring at the ceiling, and he asks Siberius, "Why do soldiers obey you?"
And Siberius, perhaps trying to sound humble, replies, "Because I march beside them in the mud, because I bleed with them."
And Maximus turns his head, smiles faintly, and says, "No, they obey because they believe you know where you are going. Never lose that certainty." And shortly after, in the year 420, the reformer king breathes his last.
Leaving behind the most powerful military apparatus on the continent with absolutely no one legally authorized to control it, it is a textbook recipe for an explosive, violent power vacuum.
Which catapults us right into Act 4.
Yes, and if Glorious was a story of innovation and Flavius a story of tragedy and Maximus a story of reform, the era we are entering now is purely a story of terrifying, unbridled ambition.
The age of Emperor Siberius Octavius Durius.
The transition from kingdom to empire is born in fire. The moment Maximus dies, the fragile social truce shatters. A civil war erupts in 420, lasting for 5 brutal years.
It's basically a war of ideologies.
Mhm.
On one side, you have the Noble Coalition. Led by a deeply conservative senator named Claudius Prismus, they argue that Gondor is fundamentally a kingdom of noble blood. They have the wealth, the old estates, and the traditional authority.
And on the other side,
On the other side, you have the Officers' Coalition, the men who actually run the machine Maximus built. And the entire outcome of this war hinges on the decision of one man, Matthias Commodus, the brilliant logistical strategist.
Marson writes that the officers' coalition initially approaches Matthias. They want him to take the crown because he is the smartest man in the room. But Matthias understands his own limitations. He gives this incredibly cold, self-aware response: I command soldiers, let another command kingdoms.
Right.
And he formally throws all his strategic weight behind his charismatic friend, Siberius.
That alliance seals the fate of the nobility. With Matthias drawing the maps and managing the supply lines, and Siberius leading the vanguard with his terrifying certainty, the noble coalition is systematically dismantled.
The Civil War culminates in 424 at the Battle of the White Valleys. And it's not even a contest. The disciplined, meritocratic legions utterly crush the mercenary armies of the nobles. By 425, Siberius rides back into the capital. The old aristocracy is imprisoned, exiled, or executed.
And this is where Siberius executes a masterstroke of political theater. He understands the psychology of power. If he simply puts Maximus's crown on his head, he will always be viewed as a usurper, a general who stole a throne.
So what does he do? He destroys the throne.
Literally destroys it.
He stands before the remnants of the Senate, covered in the dust of the Civil War, and declares the absolute abolition of the Gondorian monarchy. He announces the birth of the Gondorian Empire, with himself as the first emperor.
Marson captures his justification in a single arrogant sentence. A king rules a people, an emperor rules a civilization.
I want to push back on the idea of arrogance, though. Was it arrogant, or was it a cold, necessary calculation?
That's a fair question.
Siberius recognized that the old paradigm was obsolete. Flavius proved that noble consensus led to ruin. Maximus proved that meritocracy won wars. To manage the vast territories they had conquered and to finally eradicate the Scion threat, Siberius needed absolute, unquestioned, centralized authority. He wasn't just ruling Gondor anymore. He was organizing a continent.
I see your point. The mechanism of an empire allows for a scale of mobilization that a kingdom just can't match. And Siberius immediately starts building the architecture to reinforce this new reality. He doesn't just change the laws, he changes the skyline.
The construction of the imperial palace.
Yes. The neutral scholars note the staggering economic cost, but Marson focuses on the psychological impact. Siberius orders the palace built higher up the mountain, looming over the White City. It is constructed from stark white stone and cold black marble floors, draped in massive golden banners.
It wasn't built to be beautiful. It was built to make anyone walking into it feel incredibly small.
Exactly. He spends a decade coiling the spring. He reorganizes the government into a brutal, efficient hierarchy. Emperor at the top, delegating to the military councils and governorates. He pays new roads, expands the academies, standardizes the tax code.
And when that spring is finally released, the expansion is staggering. In 435, he launches the Eastern Campaign, pushing deep into uncharted territories, crushing local tribes, and establishing the massive governorate of Rhoetia. He follows it with a northern campaign, securing the borders against the remnants of the Zartian states.
He's swallowing the map. But his true obsession, the white whale of Gondor, is the Scion Kingdom. He wants to finish what Laureus started a century prior, and in 441 he launches the Third League War.
But he doesn't just rely on brute force this time. He utilizes espionage and treachery. The Scion Kingdom had its own internal fractures.
They did. The High Bishop of the Scion Church, a man named Laureus I, had grown deeply disillusioned with the current Scion King's secular policies.
So the religious leader of the enemy secretly opens a channel to the Gondorian emperor. The irony is thick. Laureus I begins feeding vital intelligence troop movements, supply vulnerabilities, fleet deployments directly to Matthias Commodus.
And Matthias uses that intelligence to orchestrate a masterpiece of military logistics. He coordinates a massive, multi-pronged surprise attack. They bypass the Scion strongholds, cut off their maritime supply lines, and trap the bulk of the Scion military on the Derwinian Peninsula.
Within 9 months, the war is over. The Scion admirals are captured, their armies are starved into submission. In 442, the Scions are forced to the negotiating table and sign the PRC treaty.
The geopolitical map is violently redrawn. The Scions are forced to cede Dordogne and massive tracts of their coastal territory.
Yeah.
Siberius reorganizes this land into the protected region of Sion, the PRC.
But let's look at how Siberius handles the PRC because it reveals the terrifying nature of his empire. He doesn't just occupy the land and demand taxes, he engages in aggressive, systemic assimilation. He appoints a hardened skirmisher veteran, Radius Lucius, as the governor.
And Lucius initiates a policy of cultural erasure through infrastructure. The neutral scholars detail the construction projects. They bulldoze Sion neighborhoods to build perfectly gridded Gondorian roads. They construct massive Roman-style public baths, imperial villas, and towering administrative forts.
They are trying to literally pave over the Scion identity. The logic being, if you force them to walk on Gondorian roads, bathe in Gondorian baths, and trade in Gondorian currency, eventually their children will forget they were ever Scions.
This raises an important question about assimilation, though, because human sociology is rarely that compliant. You can break an army, you can build a bathhouse, but you cannot easily eradicate a people's memory. The pressure in the PRC builds for nearly a decade until it violently explodes in the Dorwinian Rebellion of 450.
And the absolute dripping irony of this rebellion is the man who leads it, Jason Cuppers. If you are Emperor Siberius, this is your worst nightmare realized. Where did Jason Cuppers, this brilliant insurgent leader, learn how to fight?
He was educated in Gondor's own military academies. He was a product of Maximus's meritocracy. The empire, in its arrogance, had trained the very mind that would nearly dismantle it.
It's unbelievable. Cuppers uses Matthias Commodus's own logistical theories against him. He doesn't fight pitched battles. He wages a brutal, grinding, 5-year guerrilla war. He poisons the wells along the gridded roads. He assassinates the magistrates in the baths. He bleeds the imperial legions in the forests.
It forces Siberius into a terrifying realization. The machine of empire can conquer, but it struggles to pacify. The cost of maintaining the occupation is draining the treasury. So in 455, the great conqueror is forced to do something he has never done before.
He blinks.
He compromises. He signs a treaty granting Dorwinia partial independence. Now, he saves face by imposing strict conditions. Dorwinia cannot have Christian rulers, they cannot form alliances with the remaining Scion state, and Jason Cuppers must accept permanent exile. But the illusion of absolute imperial omnipotence is completely shattered.
It reveals the limits of Siberius's vision, and it perfectly sets the stage for the astonishing, intimate, and tragic finale of his reign.
Let's set the scene for this. It's the late 450s, out on the absolute furthest eastern edges of the empire, in the wild frontier of the Rashia Governorate. Strange rumors start filtering back to the capital. Rumors about a ghost from the Civil War.
Commander Tiberius Cassian Varro. During the Civil War 30 years prior, Varro had fought against Siberius. When the noble forces were crushed, Varro vanished into the eastern mountains. Everyone assumed he had died of exposure or been killed by tribes.
But a young, ambitious skirmisher officer named Aelius Marinus, doing reconnaissance on the frontier, discovers the truth. Varro isn't dead. He is alive, aged, heavily scarred, and he is out there leading a coalition of indigenous Morwaith tribes just beyond the edge of the imperial maps.
Siberius, upon hearing this, just cannot let it go. The emperor's psychology demands absolute control. A ghost from his past operating outside his authority is an intolerable insult. So he authorizes a highly classified, specialized mission.
This reads like an ancient Black Ops thriller. Aelius Marinus is given command of a small, elite strike team. He brings along Siphius Fabius, the old, patient sniper from Maximus's original trio, along with an explosives expert and a tactician. Under the cover of a moonless night, they infiltrate deep into hostile territory.
Marcin's description of the infiltration is breathless. They bypass the tribal sentries, quietly neutralize the guards, and breach Varro's command tent. They don't kill him, though. They capture the old commander alive, bind him, and drag this living ghost hundreds of miles back to the capital, straight into the heart of the black and white imperial palace.
Varro is chained, beaten, and brought before the imperial magistrates. But he makes only one request. He refuses to speak to anyone but the emperor himself.
Right.
And Siberius, in a moment of supreme arrogant curiosity, grants the request.
They meet in the throne room late at night. The marble floors are cold. The braziers are burning low. It is just the emperor, his royal guard, and the chained ghost. Marcin constructs a brilliant philosophical dialogue between them. Siberius mocks Varro, pointing out the vastness of the empire, the roads, the academies. He says, I brought order to the world. What did you bring from the dirt?
And Varro doesn't flinch.
Hmm.
He looks at Siberius and says that the Empire's expansion hasn't brought order. It has merely disturbed things that were sleeping. Varro starts speaking urgently about unseen threats massing in the Deep East. He says that by pushing the borders to the edge of the map, Siberius has drawn the attention of massive, migrating tribal confederations that make the Scions look like children.
And here is where Siberius's hubris becomes fatal. He is so desperate to hear this secret intelligence, so confident in his absolute power within his own impregnable palace, that he makes a catastrophic error in judgment. He dismisses his royal guards. He orders them out of the room so he can hear Varro's whispers privately.
The heavy doors close. The Emperor of the known world is alone with a chained man who has survived 30 years in the wilderness.
What happens next is a testament to the fact that systems, empires, and architecture are ultimately vulnerable to the sheer, unpredictable will of a single human being.
According to Marcin, Varro stops whispering. He stands up straight, he looks Siberius dead in the eye, and speaks an ancient, formal Gondorian phrase, etat finissem, which translates to, this ends now.
With a speed born of a lifetime of survival, Varro slips a hidden, crude bone blade from within his rags, a weapon the guards had missed in their arrogance. He lunges across the marble floor and drives the blade directly into the Emperor's chest.
By the time Siberius's dying screams alert the guards, and they bash the heavy doors open, it is over. Emperor Siberius Octavius Durius is bleeding out on his black marble floor, and Varro, cut down immediately by the guards' spears, dies with a smile on his face.
The irony is profound. The man who organized armies of hundreds of thousands, who built fleets that darkened the sea, who constructed a fortress designed to intimidate the gods, was killed in his own home by a single man with a piece of sharpened bone.
The assassination throws the Senate and the military councils into absolute chaotic panic. The architect of the empire is dead. But Siberius, ever the planner, had one final failsafe.
Amidst the screaming and the confusion in the Senate hall, an older statesman, Senator Gladius, steps forward. He produces a sealed imperial will. They break the wax and read the emperor's final decree regarding succession.
And the choice shocks everyone. He doesn't name a noble. He doesn't name a relative. He doesn't even name Matthias Commodus, his oldest friend and the genius of the army. He names General Saharius.
Which is an incredibly revealing choice. General Saharius was the imperial ambassador operating in the volatile, rebellious, protected region of Sion. He wasn't a conqueror who led cavalry charges. He was a spy master, a diplomat, a man accustomed to navigating espionage, suppressing insurgencies, and managing deep cultural resentment.
It's as if Siberius, in his final years, realized that the age of aggressive expansion was over. You don't need a conqueror to run an empire that has already swallowed the map.
Yeah.
You need an administrator who knows how to keep the beast from tearing itself apart from the inside.
It is a sobering acknowledgement that the system he built was incredibly fragile. The era of building was done. The era of desperate maintenance had begun.
When we pull back and look at this staggering 230-year arc, the momentum of it is just breathtaking. We started in the inland valleys with Laureus, the pragmatic visionary, who forced his people to the sea because he understood that supply chains dictate survival.
We endured the tragedy of Flavius, the philosopher king, whose empathy and reliance on consensus allowed the Scions to choke the kingdom to the brink of death.
We witnessed the absolute systemic rebirth under Maximus, who channeled the trauma of his youth to build a ruthless, meritocratic machine, elevating orphans to officers in the skirmisher corps.
And it all culminated in the terrifying ambition of Siberius, who utilized that machine to conquer the known world, only to realize that an empire is a living, breathing thing that eventually turns on its master.
If you are listening to this, I want you to think about the historical cycles happening in your own life, in your own companies, in your own communities. Are you acting like the early Gondorian generals, trying to build defensive walls when the environment demands you learn how to swim?
Are you trapped in a committee like Flavius, hoping a hard problem will just politely resolve itself if you discuss it long enough?
Or are you doing the grueling, unglamorous work of Maximus, building the internal architecture and the skills required to survive the reality of tomorrow?
History is rarely just about the past. It is a mirror reflecting our own institutional habits. But beyond the practical lessons, Marcin's chronicle leaves us with a deeply unsettling, lingering mystery.
Varro's final warning in the throne room.
Exactly. Before he struck the fatal blow, Varro warned the emperor that something else is forming in the Deep East. that by pushing the boundaries of the empire, Siberius had attracted the attention of forces far older and far more dangerous than the Siam pirates.
It leaves us with a profound question. Does expanding your borders to the edges of the map actually secure your world? Or does it simply push you right up against the monsters you didn't even know existed?
A terrifying, incredible thought to leave on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the blood, the ambition, and the staggering architectural wonders of the Gondorian Empire. Keep exploring, keep questioning the historical narratives around you, and we'll see you next time.